These 7 men represented law and order in Iosco County at one point during the 20th century. In the middle at top is Circuit Court Judge Herman Denke, who served the circuit from 1927 until 1959. At left is Russell H. McKenzie, County Clerk and Clerk of the Court. And at right is Charles Miller, County Sheriff, who was killed in the line of duty in 1934. At left in the lower group is H. Reed Smith, Judge of Probate, and the next 3 men served as county prosecutors. At top in the middle is A. W. Black, and below him is John Stewart. At right is Herbert Hertzler. Law and order in Iosco County was well served by these elected officers, as well as earlier and later office holders. Nearly a century and a half ago, when several hundred whiskey-starved men invaded the shore towns after a 6-month siege of labor in the pine forests, anything could and often did happen. The Iosco Gazette recorded what happened in its columns. The Gazette's Washington hand press was a central fixture of the newspaper office, which backed up tight against the Taos Bay waterfront in the 1870s. That location is in the vicinity of today's Taos City's town square. One of Taos City's principal business owners, Mike Murphy, a saloon keeper, is calling on editor Charles Hilburn, who is hard at work at his type rack, setting the latest news which will feature his next weekly issue. Murphy later became the editor-publisher of the Taos Herald. This is a brief account of Hilburn, who thought something should be done to rid the struggling hamlet of Taos of vice, and he set out in 1873 to do something about it through the columns of his newspaper. Writing many years later, a local historian recalled that those young men, most of them unmarried and in their teens or early 20s, quote, distributed prosperity to the merchants and others, but often made nights hideous with their noise, end quote. In his edition of April 24, 1873, editor Hilburn reported that Julia Winters, May Winters, Kate Casey, and Irish Annie had been given 6 days in which to leave the country and are, quote, pluming their wings for flight to other more congenial climes. We say this poetically because we don't want to hurt their respective admirers. Hilburn set his sights on removing one particular thorn in his and some of the townfolk's sides, a pair of rickety buildings called the halfway houses, then located just east of today's M55 US 23 intersection. Brawls among the sojourning lumberjacks and numerous Taos residents broke out in several local saloons lining Lake Street, shown here, as well as the halfway houses, and the editor reported several of these affairs in his local news columns. In one issue, Hilburn declared, quite a sensation was created Thursday night by the arrest, on complaint of John Hayes, of George P. Smith, Orlando Newman, and 4 others, all of the village of East Taos, and charged with breaking into and injuring a house. The house in question was a notorious halfway house. George P. Smith was the founder of East Taos, and the other men were respectable citizens. Newman later served in the state legislature. The 6 men who were attempting to close the houses by using wrecking tools were admitted to bail in the sum of $500 each and were to appear for trial at the May term of Iosco Circuit Court. What was particularly galling to the editor was the fact that the said John or Jack Hayes either keeper or patron of the house, was one of the most notorious rascals ever to hit the Huron shore. He lies buried in Greenwood Cemetery, a bullet being the cause of death. In another incident, that spring of 1873, Francis Corwin was sentenced to 90 days in the Detroit House of Corrections on conviction of keeping a house of ill fame at East Tawas, known as the Dutch Gardens. A new twist in court proceedings is reflected in an item appearing in the Gazette. Mrs. Frankie Corwin, reported the newspaper, was last week taken before the Circuit Court Commissioner at Bay City on a writ of habeas corpus and discharged. It was held that the entire court proceedings in the case were illegal. On May 1, 1873, Hilburn reported that Bridget Casey of the Halfway House was committed to jail under the usual charge. But in the same issue, the editor reported that the said Bridget had been bailed out of jail, shown at right, and, quote, on the evening of the same day was married to Alex Collins. Justice of the Peace John Houston performed the marriage ceremony. That same month, Hilburn reported that John Reval of Osable was arrested on the charge of keeping a house of ill repute. A day later, Maggie Howard, Maggie Doyle, and Minnie Ray, inmates of the notorious Dolly Varden, Hilburn's words, at Osable, were brought down before John Houston on a charge of disorderly conduct. We understand bail, he said, was not given, and the sheriff will leave for the Detroit House of Corrections with the ladies on the first boat. An interesting letter to the editor, entitled The Value of a Lady's Character, written by one signed The Outsider, severely criticized the community. The letter said it was a common rule of some folks in this little city of sand and sawdust to talk about the ladies, young and old. It goes from one to the other like wind, and any little story that may come out is added to, in order to make it more interesting or to show their wit. The letter writer termed many of the stories in circulation as being slanderous. In reading Hilburn's hand-set news columns, it becomes evident that he was not partial to his own beliefs and printed both sides of this controversy. In his final editorial barrage, Hilburn complained that the halfway houses were again in full blast, and that another house on Matthew Street was now occupied by the former keeper of the Michigan Exchange near Winona, today part of Bay City. This bold defiance of law and public sentiment, he said, will undoubtedly bear its legitimate fruit, in season, were his final parting words. He left Tawas for Muskegon, where he again entered the newspaper business. His newspaper office there was destroyed by fire. Was it torched? No one knew, and he left Michigan for Minnesota. Several years were required before Tawas was finally rid of what some termed a problem. As late as March 15, 1876, Sheriff Brad Smith's daily diary stated, 2 of the soiled doves from the halfway house are on the Alpena stage, bound south. During the summer of 1878, citizens of East Tawas awarded a chased pearl-handled Smith & Wesson revolver to Robert Johnson as a token of their appreciation of his courage and fidelity as a police officer. Behind this presentation is a story of the lumbering era and a man who earned the name of Desperado, one Jack Hayes, actually an alias. Picture Newman Street in the late 1870s. On the west side of the second block were several wooden buildings, 1 or 2 housing saloons. On the east side of the first block, at the southeast corner of West Stover Street, stood a two-story hotel, the American House, run by Isaiah Curry. The building was occupied many years later by Carlson's Grocery, and today is the site of Mooney's Ben Franklin store. According to the late Edna Otis, local historian, a fight developed in the saloon, and there was gunplay. An innocent bystander by the name of Owen MacDonald was shot, suffering a slight flesh wound. But wee Oney cried out, "I'm mortifying." The crowd then moved over to the American House and its saloon. There were no telephones in those days, but someone ran for Constable Johnson. A fight could have serious consequences, especially if gunplay was involved. When Constable Johnson arrived, Hayes and several of his cronies were seated at a table playing cards. It was actually a belligerent mob celebrating the 4th of July, but they knew the tough constable was after Hayes. Johnson strode over to Hayes and announced he was under arrest. Hayes reached for his revolver, but Johnson fired before Hayes could draw. His pals made no move to interfere. The crowd at the American House quickly dispersed, and Sheriff L.B. Smith was summoned from the courthouse and jail in Tawas City. A coroner's jury found that Constable Johnson killed Hayes in self-defense. An old cemetery record found by Miss Otis reads, "John Henry, better known as Jack Hayes, shot while resisting an officer, July 4, 1878. He was buried in Greenwood Cemetery on July 6, 1878. A grateful citizenry gave brave Bob Johnson the revolver a few weeks later. Soon afterward, Johnson removed from the community, and with the passing of years, his name was no longer remembered by local residents. The famous revolver turned up in 1962 when a Bay City resident loaned it to the East Tawas Centennial Committee for display in its temporary museum in the community building. 17 years later, a noted gun collector author contacted the Tawas Herald in an effort to trace the weapon for a possible feature story in a gun magazine. The collector was researching the personal records of L.N. Nemschke, noted New York engraver. He found a tracing for the backstrap of a revolver which read, "Presented to Robert Johnson by the citizens of East Tawas." The collector, a resident of Illinois, believed a good story was in the offering, and he asked the Herald to involve readers in conducting some armchair detective work in order to find and preserve a bit of a local Americana. The previously mentioned Bay City resident read the story, and the handgun was placed on loan at the Iosco County Museum in East Tawas. Its stay was brief. Harris Barkman, curator, said the owner quickly reclaimed his revolver when he realized its monetary value, especially since it was engraved by one of the country's top artists of the 19th century. As a result, the engraved pearl-handled Smith & Wesson revolver no longer is in the museum's collection. The name of the owner and the handgun's location have disappeared from museum records. A violent storm on Lake Huron had taken a heavy toll of wooden sailing craft on June 30, 1885, when a volunteer search and rescue team at Forest, Ontario, spotted a rowboat being propelled toward shore by a heavy sea. A lone survivor seemed to be crouched in the small dory when it hit the beach. The lifeguards pulled the boat to safety, only to find that they had rescued a corpse. All were shocked again when they discovered that the corpse had been lashed to the seat. Both feet were tied, and the arms were bound behind the back. Investigation by Royal Canadian Mounted Police left no doubt that the man had been murdered, but by whom? There was no clue as to why the body in the small boat had been set adrift on Lake Huron. Canadian authorities were about to order burial of the unknown corpse when it was learned that the body was that of a Michigan man, Henry B. Farrington, once the proprietor of a jewelry store at Osable, and later a convict of Jackson Prison. Years earlier, Farrington had been well known as a criminal along the St. Clair River in Michigan. He had been a resident of Saginaw and Midland and served a term in prison for counterfeiting, according to the Saginaw Courier. News that Farrington had been murdered was received with satisfaction by many residents of Osable, for the crime for which he had been convicted branded him as one of the most vicious murders in Iosco County's lumbering days. Farrington had been arraigned in 1875 before Circuit Judge J.B. Tuttle on a charge of murdering William Stewart of Osable and stealing $1,000 from his coat. As a wholesale liquor dealer selling to saloons, Stewart was accustomed to carrying large sums of cash. For this he was felled by 3 axe blows to the head and killed. The body was found the next morning on the plank sidewalk near the American House Hotel on Water Street, and not far from Farrington's jewelry shop. An inquest was held that day, and after taking testimony, the coroner's jury suspected Farrington as the person who killed Stewart. Patrick Murphy, former county sheriff, testified that he and the town constable, Sylvester Vaughn, had called at Farrington's shop and found bloodstains on the floor, and they found an axe with bloodstains. Farrington's bad reputation had led to the investigation. Farrington protested his innocence and turned state's evidence in an attempt to implicate 3 others in the murder. His testimony was not believed by the court nor the community. During numerous delays in his trial for murder over a period of 2 years, Farrington had escaped from the jail on 2 occasions, once by tunneling, and each time was captured and returned to his cell. At that time, the jail was located in the basement of the courthouse. Circumstantial evidence concerning the murder was presented during the trial, and he was finally convicted and sentenced to prison on October 3, 1877. Farrington vowed in court that he would return, seeking vengeance on the judge, the sheriff, members of the jury, and others. On his way to Jackson, Farrington escaped from Sheriff L.B. Smith, but was recaptured, only to escape once in prison and again recaptured, according to the sheriff's daily diaries. According to an 1880 report in the Tawas Herald, Farrington had a bad reputation at Osable, as well as along the St. Clair River. To sum up, said the Herald, Farrington is and ever has been a fiend, a more perfect Bill Sykes than the ones Dickens portrayed. But why was this convicted murderer out of prison only 7 years later? He certainly was not released to save Michigan the cost of incarcerating prisoners, as is the case today, more than a century later. Actually, Farrington had been released from prison following an unconditional pardon of many convicts by Governor Josiah W. Begole. The pardoning of Farrington, commented the Herald, does not take very well with the people of this county, and especially at Osable. By turning all the bad characters out of the state prison, Governor Begole is getting even with the people of Michigan for defeating him at the polls. Following his pardon by the governor, Farrington showed up briefly in Tawas City. From a saloon keeper came information that he was attempting to establish the whereabouts of the jailer, who had frustrated one of his escape attempts. Farrington was rearrested soon afterward on a charge of conspiring to kill his old enemy, the jailer. Sheriff Clark Esmond found Farrington's cell empty. He had again made his escape by sawing through a bar in the cell door. Perhaps he had outside help. No one knew. On the following day, a fisherman reported that his rowboat had been stolen from its mooring place on Tawas Bay. Inspection of the vacant shoreline on Tawas Point uncovered a shanty made of driftwood, and evidence was found that someone had spent the night there. It was believed that someone was the escaped prisoner. All trace of Farrington was lost until 28 days later, when the battered boat and his now decomposing body, bound with rope, rode out the storm-tossed waves onto the Canadian shore of Lake Huron. The slaying of this convicted murderer remains an unsolved whodunit mystery to this day. In 1916, residents of Iosco County were divided into two camps, those supporting Circuit Judge Albert Wittes and those supporting the County Board of Supervisors. Wittes, a Democrat, had been appointed by the governor, a fellow Democrat, to fill a vacancy caused by the death of the previous judge. Local Republican attorneys had been passed over for the appointment and were sore about it. The Board of Supervisors, too, resented the appointment. What emerged was a real Donnybrook, which exploded when the board voted to disallow a bill for law books, a mere $94.50, purchased by the judge for the courtroom. The books were to replace those missing since the previous judge's demise. Saying he had enough of this nonsense, Judge Wittes immediately issued an order directing the board to allow the bill, under penalty of being held in contempt of court. Ha ha! The board disregarded that order. Jim Ballard, editor of the Tawas Herald, commented, "Further developments are waited with interest." Residents of Iosco County didn't have to wait long for further developments. On Wednesday, January 16, 1916, the judge appeared personally before the board and again presented the bill. "In a gentlemanly and conciliatory manner," commented the Herald editor. Judge Wittes awaited the board's action until 10 o'clock the next morning. He walked unnoticed into the court chamber, where supervisors were meeting, and loudly rapped the court into session. He read a lengthy order to be served on each of the 21-member board, warning that he would hold them in contempt of court if they did not approve the bill. According to the Herald, several rose and expressed themselves rather freely while court was in session, thereby placing themselves in contempt. "You can't do this. You can't call court to order during our meeting," shouted several supervisors who bristled over some of the judge's comments. Those supervisors did not realize they were in the judge's ballpark, the courtroom. The angry supervisors adjourned their meeting to the basement and voted 15-4 to disallow the bill. The board then passed a resolution instructing the prosecuting attorney to uphold the dignity of the Board of Supervisors and defend its action. Prosecutor A.W. Black very willingly accepted the resolution. He too was smarting over the judge's appointment, having been passed over by the governor. That afternoon, Judge Wittes ordered the arrest of Supervisors Thomas J. Robinson, Harold M. Belknap, and John Searle, setting February 3rd as a date for the defendants to answer for contempt of court. The three supervisors were fined $250 each and sentenced to 20 days in jail. The prosecuting attorney was held in contempt of court for appearing as attorney for supervisors when his office required that he appear for the court. All screamed, "You can't do this!" He did. Telegraph lines between Tawas City and Detroit hummed as James Mark, the local stringer for the Detroit Free Press, filed column after column of information on a sensational story. Western Union kept that line open as a special favor to the Free Press. It had exclusive coverage of the story. Local residents had a field day of fun to see the supervisors jailed, especially Sheriff Collie Johnson. Previously, the supervisors had slashed the jail budget and ordered the cost of each meal to be reduced by several cents. As a result, fare served in the jail proved to be rather simple for the three supervisors and prosecutors: poached herring, then the cheapest food on the market. The fun was spoiled when a writ of habeas corpus was made to Judge Sharp of West Branch, which was granted. The Ogama sheriff took the four prisoners to West Branch and were admitted to bail in the sum of $500 each. The sensational case apparently ended there, and the circuit court got its law books, after the Board of Supervisors was admonished by Judge Sharp for their unwarranted action. But for a while, it was certainly great fun for Sheriff Johnson. People on the street, when meeting members of the Board of Supervisors, always asked, "How did you like the poached herring?" Judge Wittes may have lacked the support of local politicians, but he certainly held the confidence of the majority of Iosco voters in his stand against the Board of Supervisors. He was elected to his first regular term of office that year by a 2-to-1 margin and was re-elected thereafter, serving until 1927, when death ended his career. Among his noteworthy opinions was one upheld an appeal to the Michigan Supreme Court. That opinion overturned the old riparian rights law, which provided exclusive commercial fishing privileges in those waters. Controversy was not over for Albert Wittes following his fight with the County Board of Supervisors. The December 4, 1927 issue of the Detroit Free Press, in reporting his retirement, said that political attempts to oust Judge Wittes extended to the state Supreme Court and to the state legislature. Both were unsuccessful. Never to give in, the Board of Supervisors abandoned a tradition of many years. A framed portrait of Judge Wittes was never hung with those of his predecessors in the old Iosco courthouse. That was remedied in 1957, 30 years after the judge's death, and none of the other participants in that old row were still alive. A portrait of Judge Wittes graces a circuit court chamber in the Iosco County building, along with those judges before and after that embattled jurist. The courtroom is still the bailiwick of today's judges. The Board of Commissioners has its own meeting place, but only after more than a decade meeting in the circuit court chamber. Nearly 76 years ago, one court administered lightning-fast justice to a defendant convicted of a major crime of violence. The niceties of lengthy pretrial investigation would come in the future. It is recorded in the Journal of Iosco Circuit Court that on July 5, 1934, A.J. Wood was sentenced to life imprisonment on one count of murder and to a 40 to 50-year term on a second count. A day later, he was on his way to Southern Michigan Prison, Jackson, where he spent the remainder of his life. It is not surprising that the wheels of justice turned so rapidly in this instance. Wood had entered a guilty plea, accepted by the court, of murdering 4 people, one of whom was a man, if alive, would have placed him behind bars. This quadruple murder was the most shocking crime in the history of the county. That tragic night of July 1st, 1934, started innocently enough. A beach party, attended by young couples, all prominent professionals and local business owners, was interrupted by a sudden rain squall. The group was invited to the home of another couple on West State Street, East Tawas. After a brief period, several of the couples went to their homes, and the remainder of the party continued to play the radio, dance, play cards, and have a good time. Wood, who lived with his daughter and son-in-law in the home where the party was being held, was awakened by loud music, which he hated. It was later said he neither drank liquor nor smoked tobacco, nor believed in partying, but he walked into the kitchen armed with a 12-gauge sawed-off shotgun. In terrible anger, according to the Tawas Herald, he went through the living room and out on the lawn. He encountered his first victim on the porch and felled him with a blast to the abdomen. The terrified guests tried to flee, but Wood fired 3 more shots, mortally wounding a husband and his wife and injuring a third man, who ran into the bathroom, locked the door, and escaped through the window. The shooting brought to the scene Sheriff Charles C. Miller, who was called by a witness after he had seen the first victim fall to the ground. The sheriff was accompanied by his wife, Grace, who went to a nearby house. A combat veteran of World War I, Miller had gained a reputation for bravery as a police officer in his home community. But with scant information as to what had actually taken place, coupled with the fact that it was long after midnight, dark and stormy, the 38-year-old police officer was walking alone into a death trap. He had no backup. Sheriff Miller's speeding car had been stopped a block away by a citizen of East Tawas, warning him to be careful and to be prepared to shoot. Rounding the rear of the house, the sheriff was met by gunfire and wounded by a shotgun blast. Miller fell, and one of the unarmed neighbors hidden behind a tree on the south side of the street said to others, "He got Charlie," according to one account. "Silence for a short time that seemed an eternity," wrote Edna Otis in the Gazette edition of July 5th. Other officers arrived, and the sheriff was found at the garage, badly wounded. An ambulance sped with him to Omer Hospital, but he died en route. Wood returned to the house, finished dressing, then walked the 2.5 to 3 miles to Tawas City along the railroad tracks. A telephone call to a house nearby to the scene at East Tawas brought Deputy Sheriff Clarence Fowler to the jail, where Wood was found waiting on the porch. A story later in a detective magazine related that Wood feared a lynch mob, but he was safe in jail. A relative of one of the victims did throw a punch at the killer in the courtroom, but that was all. According to editor P.N. Thornton of the Herald, Wood came from Oklahoma 6 months earlier to make his home with the Jansons and their children. When he appeared at the jail, he still carried the shotgun and several shells. 4 days after that night of terror, Wood was arraigned before Circuit Judge Herman Denke and admitted to the 4 murders. The judge found Wood guilty in the 2nd degree for the murder of Lloyd Hayes, and he was sentenced to life in prison. He received a second term of 40 to 50 years for the killing of Mrs. Hayes. Charges against Wood in the murder of Dr. Stanley Summers, his first victim, and Sheriff Miller, his last, were held in abeyance. Had he outlived the first 2 sentences, he would have faced the next 2 charges. The judge made certain the convicted killer would never leave prison. 6 small children lost their parents or a father that tragic night, and there were 2 widows. Judge Denke retired in 1959 after a long and noteworthy career on the bench. Elected to succeed him was a young attorney who, as a boy, had remained home with his 2 younger brothers while his father and mother went to East Tawas to answer an urgent telephone call. Judge Allen C. Miller retired after a distinguished career on the circuit bench here, later serving in the federal courts until another retirement. He and his wife spend their summers in the old hometown, enjoying family and friends. Today, Sheriff Charles C. Miller is remembered in an expanded display of photographs in the foyer of the Iosco County Jail, along with a permanent display in the Iosco County Museum. A small tribute to one who risked his all in answer to a telephone call on a dark night as a police officer. A sensational murder case with a bizarre conclusion is recorded in the Journal of Iosco Circuit Court. The murder of an 11-year-old boy in late June 1936 baffled Iosco and state authorities for 4 years. Then, in February 1940, a startling break in the case when a confession was made. Although that confession was later repudiated and probably would not be admitted into evidence today, it was acceptable in a circuit court trial in 1940. Because of shocking details released to the press, the murder of the 11-year-old fairly exploded on the front pages of Michigan newspapers. Top-notch investigators, professional and amateur, flocked to the scene, all bent on gaining fame by finding some clue to break the case. Included was a writer for Official Detective Stories, a twice-monthly 10-cent magazine, which printed sensational accounts of such tragedies. The magazine offered a reward of $500 for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the killer. The Detroit Times and Detroit News each offered cash awards of $500. Those newspaper rewards were never collected, but receiving the $500 reward from the magazine in August 1941, 5 years after it was originally offered, was Nellie Brooks of Tawas City, a businesswoman intensely interested in criminal investigation. Fiend leaves few clues in getaway, blared the headline in the July 3, 1936 issue of the Tawas Herald. On Saturday, June 21, 3 men sailing for minnows in the Eau Gray River off M55, Reno Township, found the mutilated body of a boy who had been missing since the previous Monday. The youth had been visiting relatives in Reno for 5 months on that fateful day of his death. He had accompanied his aunt to the pasture to get the cows, but then walked off down the river. The boy simply disappeared. Following discovery of the boy's body 4 days later, the area was crawling with police officers and reporters. First to arrive was Sheriff John F. Moran, Under Sheriff Harry Rowland, and Coroner W.A. Evans. Also arriving were Michigan State Police, headed by Captain Joseph F. Kearney, with a detail from Bay City, Corporal Hiram Grimison of West Branch Post, and Lieutenant Philip Hudson, noted manhunter from the State Police Criminal Investigation Bureau at East Lansing. No clues were found, and the investigation continued day and night through the next week. A thorough investigation of every angle of the case was made for several weeks, but the crime baffled officers. Weeks passed into months, and the murder was permitted to rest temporarily in the hope that persons with knowledge of the case would come forth. There the case rested until February 23, 1940, when state police announced that a confession to the crime had been made by a person who had once lived on a farm not far from the pond where the boy's body had been found. Earlier, Mrs. Brooks had befriended the person involved and furnished employment in the Brooks Exchange Store on Newman Street, East Tawas. After becoming suspicious that the subject knew pertinent facts about the case, Mrs. Brooks informed Sheriff Moran and the state police. She then proceeded to learn what the subject knew, requiring 45 days of her own investigation. A week later, the climax was reached when the suspect made a signed confession before state police and Mrs. Brooks. 4 years earlier, Captain Kearney intentionally released information to the press containing exaggerations relative to the boy's mutilated body. Only Kearney, the coroner, and 2 others, Bay City Times Stringer reporter George Miles of Tawas City and Herald editor P.N. Thornton, all pledged to secrecy, were aware of the truth, along with the murderer. When interrogated, the suspect denied certain aspects of the mutilation, including cutting out the boy's tongue, which denial was certain proof of guilt on the suspect's part as far as Captain Kearney was concerned. That exaggeration had been reported in the daily press in 1936, including the information that the tongue had been found in the mouth of a turtle. The confession was repudiated the following day when the suspect obtained legal counsel, but after arraignment in Justice Court, the suspect was bound over to Circuit Court to stand trial on a murder charge. The defendant's attorney went to great lengths to protect his client, even obtaining release from jail under bail while awaiting trial. The attorney, who wrote a weekly column for the Iosco Gazette, began arguing the case from his point of view in the newspaper. This drew a sharp order from Judge Herman Denke, who ordered the attorney and the newspaper editor to cease and desist. The trial counsel's effort averted a first or second-degree murder conviction, as the jury brought in a verdict of manslaughter after a long deliberation, which required overnight stay in a nearby hotel. One of the jurors once related that he had just been married and spent his honeymoon in the jury's sequestered quarters, minus his bride, at the expense of the county. The defendant was sentenced to 15 years in a state penal institution by Judge Denke. The state Supreme Court granted leave to appeal for a new trial in September 1941. But following a second hearing, the case went no further, inasmuch as new witnesses failed to disclose facts at the original trial or earlier in the inquest. In the meantime, the Iosco Board of Supervisors voted 16-2 not to allow a $350 bill for investigation of the case by Mrs. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks continued her interest in criminal investigation, but never again stepped into the role of an amateur detective. And for years afterwards, some residents of Reno and Plainfield townships were just not satisfied with the jury's verdict.